It's quite interesting when writers and storytellers and novelists, when they tell us stories, when they use their art to tell a story, to amuse us, to entertain us, to make our life experiences richer through their art. And it's even more interesting when they talk about their art and how to pursue that, when they give lessons in their art. And if you're somebody who writes or aspires to write, then I've got a really interesting podcast for you today. It's about an essay written by Zadie Smith, which is called Fail Better. Tells you about the complexities and idiosyncrasies of writing. What makes a good writer? Is it just an expression of self? What should novelists do? What about the readers? And how should we write? How should we go about our writing business? It covers these questions, and I'm sure you'd find a lot of value in it. So, without any delay, let me narrate some parts of the essay. First, the tale of Clive. I want you to think of a young man called Clive. Clive is on a familiar literary mission. He wants to write the perfect novel. Clive has a lot going for him. He's intelligent and well-read. He's made a study of contemporary fiction and can see clearly where his peers have gone wrong. He's read a good deal of rigorous literary theory, those elegant blueprints for novels not yet built, and is now ready to build his own unparalleled house of words. Maybe Clive even teaches novels, takes them apart and puts them back together. If writing is a craft, he has all the skills, every tool. Clive is ready. He clears out the spare room in his flat, invests in an ergonomic chair, and sits down in front of the blank possibility of the Microsoft Word program. Hovering above his desktop, he sees the perfect outline of his platonic novel. All he needs to do is to drag it from the ether into the real. He's excited. He begins. Fast forward 3 years. Somehow, despite all Clive's best efforts, the novel he has pulled into existence is not the perfect novel that floated so tantalizingly above his computer. It is rather a poor simulacrum, a shadow of a shadow. In the transition from the dream to the real, it has shed its aura of perfection. Its shape is warped, unrecognizable. Something got in the way, something almost impossible to articulate. For example, when it came to fashioning the character of the corrupt Hispanic government economist Maria Gomez, who is so vital to Clive's central theme of corruption within American identity politics, he found he needed something more than simply the right words or knowledge about economists. Maria Gomez effectively proves his point about the deflated American dream. But in other ineffable ways, she seems not quite to convince as he had hoped. He found it hard to get into her silk blouse, her pencil skirt, even harder to get under her skin. And then later, trying to describe her marriage, he discovered that he wanted to write cleverly and aphoristically about marriage with a capital M far more than he wanted to describe Maria's particular marriage, which, thinking of his own marriage, seemed suddenly a monumentally complex task. particularly if his own wife, Karina, was going to read it. And there are a million other little examples, flaws that are not simply flaws of language or design, but rather flaws of what, him? This thought bothers him for a moment, and then another, far darker thought comes. Is it possible that if he were only the reader and not the writer of this novel, he would think it as a failure? Clive does not wallow in such thoughts for long. His book gets an agent, his agent gets a publisher. His novel goes out into the world. It is well received. It turns out that Clive's book smells like literature and looks like literature, and maybe even intermittently feels like literature. And after a while, Clive himself has almost forgotten that strange feeling of untruth, of self-betrayal that his novel first roused in him. He becomes not only a fan of his own novel, but its great defender. If a critic points out an overindulgence here, a purple passage there, well, then Clive explains this is simply what he intended. It was all to achieve a certain effect. In fact, Clive doesn't mind such criticism. Nitpicking of this kind feels superficial compared to the bleak sense his first had that his novel was not only not good, but not true. No one is accusing him of so large a crime. The critics, when they criticize, speak of the paintwork and brickwork of the novel, a bad metaphor, a tedious denouement, and are confident he will fix these little mistakes next time around. As for Maria Gomez, everybody agrees that she is just as you would imagine a corrupt Hispanic government economist in a pencil skirt to be. Clive is satisfied and is vindicated. He begins working on a sequel. That is the end of the tale of Clive. Its purpose was to suggest that somewhere between a critic's necessary superficiality and a writer's natural dishonesty, the truth of how we judge literary success or failure is lost. It is very hard to get writers to speak frankly about their own work, particularly in a literary market where they are required to be not only writers, but also hucksters selling product. It is always easier to depersonalize the question. In preparation for this essay, I emailed many writers to ask how they judge their own work. One writer of a naturally analytical and philosophical bent replied by refining my simple question into a series of more interesting ones. I have often thought it would be fascinating to ask living writers. Never mind critics, what do you yourself think is wrong with your writing? How did you dream of your book before it was created? What were your best hopes? How have you let yourself down? A map of disappointments, that would be a revelation. Map of disappointments? Nabokov would call that a good title for a bad novel. It strikes me as a suitable guide to the land where writers live, a country I imagine as mostly beach, with hopeful writers standing on the shoreline while their perfect novels pile up over the opposite coast out of reach. Thrusting out of the shoreline are hundreds of piers or disappointing bridges, as Joyce called them. Most writers, most of the time, get wet. Why they get wet is of little interest to critics or readers, who can only judge the soggy novel in front of them. But for the people who write novels, what it takes to walk the pier and get into the other side is, to say the least, a matter of some importance. To writers, writing well is not simply a matter of skill, but a question of character. What does it take, after all, to write well? What personal qualities does it require? What personal resources does a bad writer lack? In most areas of human endeavor, We are not shy of making these connections between personality and capacity. Why do we never talk about these things when we talk about books? It is my experience that when a writer meets other writers and the conversation turns to the fault lines of their various prose styles, then you hear a slightly different language than the critic's language. Writers do not say, "My research wasn't sufficiently thorough," or "I thought Casablanca was in Tunisia," or "I seem to reify the idea of femininity." At least they don't consider problems like these to be central. They're concerned with the ways in which what they have written reveals or betrays their best or worst selves. Writers feel, for example, that what appear to be bad aesthetic choices very often have an ethical dimension. Writers know that between the Platonic idea of the novel and the actual novel, there's always the pesky self, vain, deluded, myopic, cowardly, compromised. That is why writing is the craft that defies craftsmanship. Craftsmanship alone will not make a novel great. This is hard for young writers like Clive to grasp at first. A skilled cabinet maker will make good cabinets, and a skilled cobbler will mend your shoes. But skilled writers very rarely write good books, and almost never write great ones. There is a wrong element somewhere. For convenience sake, we'll call it the self. Although in less metaphysically challenged times, the soul would have done just as well. In our public literary conversations, we are squeamish about the connection between selves and novels. We are repelled by the idea that writing fiction might be, among other things, a question of character. We like to think of fiction as the playground of language, independent of its originator. That's why, in the public imagination, the confession, "I did not tell the truth," signifies failure when James Frey says it, and means nothing at all if John Updike says it. I think that fiction writers know different. Though we rarely say it publicly, we know that our fictions are not as disconnected from ourselves as we like to imagine and we like to pretend. It is this intimate side of literary failure that is so interesting. The ways in which writer fails on their own terms. Private, difficult to express, easy to ridicule, completely unsuited for either the regulatory atmosphere of reviews or the objective interrogation of seminars, and yet, despite all this, true. First things first, writers do not have perfect or even superior knowledge about the quality or otherwise of their own work. God knows most writers are quite deluded about the nature of their own talent. But writers do have a different kind of knowledge than either professors or critics. Occasionally, it's worth listening to. The insight of the practitioner is, for better or worse, unique. It's what you find in the criticism of Virginia Woolf, of Roland Barthes. What unites those very different critics is the confidence with which they made the connection between personality and prose. To be clear, theirs was neither strictly biographical criticism nor prescriptively moral criticism. And nothing they wrote was reducible to the childish formulations, "Only good men write good books," or "One must know a man's life to understand his work." But neither did they think of a writer's personality as an irrelevance. They understood style precisely as an expression of personality in its widest sense. A writer's personality is his manner of being in the world. His writing style is the unavoidable trace of that manner. When you understand style in these terms, you don't think of it as merely a matter of fanciful syntax, or as the flamboyant icing atop a plain literary cake. nor as the uncontrollable result of some mysterious velocity coiled within language itself. Rather, you see style as a personal necessity, as the only possible expression of particular human consciousness. Style is a writer's way of telling the truth. Literary success or failure, by this measure, depends not only on the refinement of words on a page, but in the refinement of a consciousness, what Aristotle called the education of the emotions. But before we go any further along that track, we find T.S. Eliot, that most distinguished of critic practitioners, standing in our way. In his famous essay of 1919, Tradition and the Individual Talent, Eliot decimated the very idea of individual consciousness, of personality in writing. There was hardly any such thing, he claimed, and what there was not interesting. For Eliot, the most individual and successful aspects of a writer's work were precisely those places where his literary ancestors asserted their immortality most vigorously. The poet and his personality were irrelevant. The poetry was everything. And the poetry could only be understood through the glass of literary history. That essay is written in so high church a style, with such imperious authority, that even if all your affective experience as a writer is to the contrary, you are intimidated to believing it. Poetry, says Eliot, is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. The progress of an artist, says Eliot. The progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality. These credos seem so impersonal themselves, so disinterested, that it is easy to forget that young critic practitioners make the beds they wish to lie in, and it was in Eliot's interest, given the complexity and scandals of his private life and his distaste for intrusion, ruthlessly to separate the personal from the poetry. He was so concerned with privacy that it influences his terminology. Everywhere in that essay, there is the assumption that personality amounts to simply the biographical fact of one's life. But that is a narrow vision. Personality is much more than autobiographical detail. It's our way of processing the world, our way of being, and it cannot be artificially removed from our activities. It is our way of being active. Eliot may have been ruthlessly impersonal in his writing in the superficial sense, but never was a man's work more inflected with his characters, with his beliefs about the nature of the world. As for that element of his work that he puts forward as a model of his impersonality, a devotion to tradition, such devotion is the very definition of personality in writing. The choices a writer makes within a tradition, preferring Milton to Molière, caring for Barthes over Barthelme, constitute some of the most personal information we can have about him. Here is another novelist in another email answering the question, how would you define literary failure? I was once asked by a high school student in an audience in Chennai, why, sir, are you so eager to please? That's how I tend to define failure. Work done for that Heidegger called das Man, the indeterminate, they who hang over your shoulder, warping your sense of judgment, and he would call your authenticity. That novelist, like me, I suppose like all of us who came of age under postmodernity, is naturally skeptical of the concept of authenticity, especially what is called cultural authenticity. After all, how can any of us be more or less authentic than we are? We were taught that authenticity was meaningless. How then to deal with the fact that when we account for our failings as writers, the feeling that is strongest is a betrayal of one's deepest authentic self? That sounds very grand. Maybe it's better to start at the simplest denomination of literary betrayal, the critic's favorite, the cliché. What is a cliché except language passed down by das man, used and shop-soiled by so many before you, and in no way the correct jumble of language for the intimate part of your vision you meant to express? With a cliché, you have pandered to a shared understanding, you have taken a shortcut, you have represented what was pleasing and familiar rather than risked what was true and strange. It is an aesthetic and an ethical failure. To put it very simply, you have not told the truth. When writers admit to failures, they like to admit to the smallest ones. For example, in each of my novels, somebody rummages in their purse for something because I was too lazy and thoughtless and unawake to separate purse from its old persistent friend, rummage. To rummage through a purse is to sleepwalk through a sentence. A small enough betrayal of self, but a betrayal all the same. To speak personally, the very reason I write is so that I might not sleepwalk through my entire life. But it is easy to admit that a sentence makes you wince, less easy to confront the fact that for many writers there will be paragraphs, whole characters, whole books through which one sleepwalks and for which inauthentic is truly the correct term. All this talk of authenticity, of betrayal, presupposes a duty, an obligation that the writers and readers of literature are under. It is deeply unfashionable to conceive of such a thing as a literary duty. What that might be, how we might fail to fulfill it. Duty is not a very literary term. These days, when we speak of literary duties, we mean it from the reader's perspective as a consumer of literature. We are really speaking of consumer rights. By this measure, the duty of writers is to please readers and to be eager to do so. And this duty has various subsets. The duty to be clear, to be interesting and intelligent, but never willfully obscure. To write with the average reader in mind, to be in good taste. Above all, the modern writer has a duty to entertain. Personally, I have no objection to books that entertain and please, that are clear and interesting and intelligent, that are in good taste and are not willfully obscure. But neither do these qualities seem to me in any way essential to the central experience of fiction. And if they should be missing, this in no way rules out the possibility that the novel I'm reading will yet fulfill the only literary duty I care about. For writers, I have only one duty, as I see it. The duty to express accurately their way of being in the world. If that sounds woolly and imprecise, I apologize. Writing is not a science, and I am speaking to you in the only terms I have to describe what it is and persistently aim for when I sit in front of my computer. And finally, a note to readers. A novel is a two-way street in which the labor required on either side is in the end equal. Reading done properly is every bit as tough as writing. I really believe that. As for those people who align reading with the essential passive experience of watching television, they only wish to debase reading and readers. The more accurate analogy is that of the amateur musician playing her sheet music on the stand and preparing to play. She must use her own hard-won skills to play this piece of music. The greater the skill, the greater the gift she gives the composer and the composer gives her. This is a conception of reading we rarely hear now. And yet, when you practice reading, when you spend time with the book, the old moral of effort and reward is undeniable. Reading is a skill and an art, and readers should take pride in their abilities and have no shame in cultivating them, if for no other reason than the fact that writers need you. To respond to the ideal writer takes an ideal reader, the type of reader who is open enough to allow into their own mind a picture of human consciousness so radically different from their own as to be almost offensive to reason. The ideal reader steps up the plate of the writer's style so that together writer and reader might hit the ball out of the park. What I'm saying is, a reader must have talent. Quite a lot of talent, actually, because even the most talented reader will find much of the land of literature tricky terrain. For how many of us feel the world to be as Kafka felt it? Too impossibly foreshortened to ride from one village to the next? Or can imagine a world without nouns as Borges did? How many are willing to be as emotionally generous as Dickens, or to take religious faith as seriously as did Graham Greene? Who among us have Zora Neale Hurston's capacity for joy or Douglas Coupland's strong stomach for the future? Who has the delicacy to tease out Flaubert's faintest nuance, or the patience and the will to follow David Foster Wallace down his intricate recursive spirals of thought? The skills that it takes to write are required to read it. Readers fail writers just as often as writers fail readers. Readers fail when they allow themselves to believe the old mantra that fiction is the thing you relate to, and writers the amenable people you seek out when you want to have your own version of the world confirmed and reinforced. That is certainly one of the many things fiction can do. But it's a conjurer's trick within a far deeper magic. To become better readers and writers, we have to ask of each other a little bit more.